Welcome to Penang Institute's podcast series, The Road Ahead, where we discuss contemporary ideas that can shape our shared future. The fate of developing economies is one of the most important subjects of our time, especially with the rapidly changing global landscape, the great realignments of the global supply chain, the rapid adoption of AI technology, and the rush towards renewable energy. These are some of the things that define the changing landscape today. The narrative for the development growth model for many decades have always been about free trade and liberal capital markets, but history has taught us otherwise. How do developing economies navigate in these changing times? My name is Fazil Irwan Som, and with me today is Professor Donald Low, Senior Lecturer at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, HKUST, and Director of Leadership and Public Policy Executive Education at the same university. Professor Low, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just start with something more personal. If you can share with us a bit of your background, what has been your experience that led you to the university that you're teaching in today?
I started my career as a public servant, right, as a civil servant in the Singapore Administrative Service. I served about 14 years in the Singapore government. Probably the longest stretch was at the Ministry of Finance, where I was involved with preparing the budget, doing overall fiscal planning and fiscal policy for a couple of years. And then I was also in the Singapore government doing something called scenario planning, right, thinking about the future, challenges as well as opportunities for Singapore. What were some of the major trends that might alter, right, Singapore's future, and how should Singapore respond? Then in 2012, I left government and I joined academia, first at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which is part of National University of Singapore. There I continued my work on public policies and behavioral economics in the LKY school. In 2019, I left Singapore and joined the Hong Kong University of Science and Tech, where I'm Professor of Practice. I'm also a senior lecturer and I teach courses in behavioral economics, in finance and financial crisis, in economic development, which is the subject of our discussion today.
Okay. So I guess during that scenario planning stage is when you probably deep dive around the issues facing Singapore at that time, and perhaps that's what brings you to a lot of discussions in your book, The Hard Choices,
right,
on the Singapore Consensus. So in that, I can understand that there's 6 main features that characterizes Singapore's thinking paradigm. So it's very interesting to see that, for example, if I can just summarize it, if you don't mind. One is the extreme form of elite governance to guard against populist, myopic and demagogic politics. Number 2 is strict meritocracy. Number 3 is the high degree of state paternalism. Number 4 is the aversion to state welfare and the general indifference to the issues of inequality. Number 5 is the high level of skepticism about the appropriateness of ordinary democratic arrangements. And number 6 is the belief in the possibility and desirability of social engineering. So I guess this shapes the whole thinking philosophy when it comes to the ideation of policy making in Singapore. Right. Would you say so?
Yes. So for instance, elite governance. I think to understand these features of governance and policy making in Singapore, you have to understand also the context that Singapore's founding generation of leaders led by Lee Kuan Yew found themselves in, which was this state of extreme, in their minds at least, if not in reality, this state of extreme vulnerability. Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965, and I guess the conventional wisdom then was that city-states were a geopolitical joke, right? That you can't survive in this, during the Cold War era. That cities had inherent limitations. And on top of the geopolitical realities was also these constant reference to our ethnic makeup, our multi-ethnic makeup. Diversity in those days wasn't seen as a strength. Right? It was something that has to be at best managed. At worst, it could cause conflict. So I think the reaction, or at least the response to that political context that Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues faced was to build a system of governance that would suppress or would marginalize these populist voices, right? These myopic voices that would appeal to the masses, at least in the short term, but would lead the country to ruin. So right from the start, I think Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues prioritized not just economic development, but also state development, right? Ensure that the civil service is not just competent, but run on meritocratic lines, right? So scholarships, an emphasis on ensuring that we attract some of the best and brightest Singaporeans into the civil service. The idea was that if you get public policies right, you secure Singapore's future, right? Economically, in terms of social development, in terms of security as well. So that explains the kind of elite governance mentality, as well as the meritocratic underpinnings of the Singapore government. Now, my criticism is not of elite governance per se, right? But rather the sort of, or meritocracy per se, but rather the sort of side effects that this form of governance might produce. So, for instance, elite governance might become elitist, that you think that governance is the sole preserve of these, of a narrow elite, and you distrust and you are unwilling to give more agency, give more decision rights to a population that by their own policies had become one of the most, if not the most educated in the world. So my objection to elite governance was not elite governance per se, but that it becomes too exclusive, right? It becomes elitist, it becomes unrepresentative, it kind of...
You can't feel the pulse of society.
Yes, you become too remote, too disconnected from the lived realities of citizens, right? So I think that's when elite governance becomes inappropriate, an albatross to Singapore's progress. And you do see signs of that, right? I mean, if you look at rising inequality, you look at rising cost of living in Singapore, Singaporeans feel that leaders are out of touch. And from time to time, you see that leaders are out of touch. Yet another dimension of elite governance is that leaders are all cut from the same cloth, right? That there isn't sufficient diversity, there isn't sufficient contest and variety of ideas, right? Because if they all come from the same elite backgrounds, went to the same schools, went to the same universities, top
it's
universities.
Predictable. The power sources are predictable in Singapore.
Yeah, so it's not just the ideas are predictable, it's that they do not welcome contestation of their ideas. They do not feel that they need to prove or demonstrate the superiority of the idea. So increasingly, elite governance becomes not just unrepresentative and undiverse. Elite governance can also become kind of pedantic, right? Say, you don't know what Singapore's vulnerabilities, you don't understand our context, to shut down debate, right? And to say that we have succeeded because of the absence of competition. We have succeeded because of we didn't have to pander to these democratic pressures, right? We suppress these democratic tendencies. We suppress civil society. We shut down dissenting voices. That's why we succeeded, right? It's thanks to elite governance. It's thanks to the wisdom and the superior knowledge of these elite. And the superior intelligence of these elites that Singapore got to where it is today. So that's another dimension in which elite governance can start to decay, right? Can atrophy, right? When you start believing that Singapore's success is due entirely or due mostly to these elites in power.
Right. I guess we can appreciate the fact that, of course, Singapore being a country with the least resources, there's not much resources. Geography is destiny, meaning to say without those natural resources, you're bound to be exposed by the vagaries of the global landscape, and therefore they don't really have enough bargaining chip for trade-offs, unlike those with natural resources, for example. So I guess trying to understand from that perspective that that's why Singapore has that kind of mentality. And of course, the elite governance structure is basically in that same mold to because this is all we have, we have to protect it as much as we can. So I guess historically they come from that. Yeah. But you're right. For Singapore to move on in this changing world, they need to listen to the ground better, I guess.
Yeah, and it's more than that even, right? I mean, even this framing of Singapore as being exceptionally vulnerable because we lack natural resources. Well, it's not as if countries that are rich in natural resources have done very well either, right? I mean, you've heard all of us have heard of something called the resource curse. If you are right, rich in resources, that actually hurts your development, right? Yes. Because you become overly reliant on whether it's oil revenues or whatever commodities you have buried in the ground. I mean, Malaysia suffers a bit from the resource curse. So this lack of resources is also a product, right? It's also a manufactured idea by the elites, that precisely because we are short of resources, you need, and because we don't have talent, we don't have resources, you need, this is the best that Singapore can come up with, right? This tiny group of elites. I think Lee Kuan Yew was once quoted to have said that if you put all of Singapore's elites in a Boeing aircraft and that Boeing aircraft crashes, then Singapore is done for. I mean, so you can see how these elite narratives are self-serving, right? They create the illusion that Singapore has no options, that Singapore is destined, condemned by its circumstance, both geopolitics as well as its lack of resources, into this, very paternalistic, very almost authoritarian, you might say, form of government, that and why democracy is not suitable, right? If it were external commentators that saying, given Singapore circumstances, this is the best form of government, I think people kind of can accept that. But when it's the elites themselves, right, that are in power, that propagate this narrative, then rightfully citizens should be skeptical because it is so self-serving, right?
Yeah, true. And okay, the other thing I would like to talk about is this whole, strict meritocracy and this governance that wards off these divisive tendencies that you talk about. Don't you think this is a hope of every country, to have some stability and to ensure that divisive leaders don't have a free rein to split the country and create unrest?
So meritocracy as an ideal is not questioned. I mean, what is the alternative? Surely we don't want a system where power, wealth are distributed on the basis of inheritance, for instance, right? Regardless of your quality of your next generation, by virtue of the fact that they were born to the right families or the families in power, they should inherit power, right? Or they should inherit wealth. We don't like that, right? It's clearly the case that meritocracy is superior to hereditary or other forms of system that distributes resources or that distribute rewards. But I think, again, the critique of meritocracy in Singapore is not that meritocracy in itself is bad, right? But that meritocracy in Singapore increasingly becomes a justification for, say, inequality, right? If you're poor, it's just a result of your lack of ability or your lack of hard work, and so you deserve your fate. And if you're
rich, a very neoclassical view. Exactly,
right? Singapore also uses that argument. Therefore, we shouldn't have wealth taxes, for instance. Therefore, we shouldn't have capital gains taxation, right? Singapore also doesn't have inheritance tax or estate duty, even though I think all of us can agree that we do not earn the wealth that we inherited, right? We do not deserve that wealth. So I think the problem with meritocracy, it creates a sense of entitlement, right, among the elites, which is very ironic because the main reason the PAP government doesn't like stronger or more universal social welfare is that it breeds a sense of entitlement. Well, so guess what? When you don't have this sort of universal social provision or more broad-based social provision, then meritocracy becomes a justification for why we don't redistribute as much as other countries do. Right? Meritocracy becomes a justification for a sense of entitlement, except this time the sense of entitlement comes not from the poor, but comes from the rich, right? If I'm rich and successful, it's because of my talent and my hard work, and I deserve it. Then you say, what about the poor? Well, they also deserve their fit because they lack the talents and they lack the willingness to work hard. So you can see that meritocracy also feeds into and justifies, legitimizes high, not just Singapore's elite governance, but also high levels of inequality.
Right.
And this general aversion among the population towards more redistributive arrangements.
So I guess that trickles into the Singapore welfare, Singapore's perspective of welfare.
Yes.
The welfare system.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore generally, or Singaporeans generally, are quite ambiguous about inequality, right? They kind of see it as, as necessary, or at least a necessary evil, right? If you want to maintain incentives for people to work hard, to strive, to innovate, so they kind of see inequality as, a good thing to have. But again, we have to look at, you have to interrogate what sort of inequality are we talking about? If it's inequality that is produced by, the market, right? People striving, people have different abilities, and that inequality is the product of, fair competition. I think people can accept that. But when inequality is the product, say, of purely inheritance, inherited wealth, inherited privilege, or worse, inequality is the product of those already rich using their access to power, using their access to resources to reduce opportunities to
and expand their own.
Entrench their positions, right? And it doesn't have to be corrupt, right? It doesn't have to be corruption. It can be entirely legal, right? Or the rich and powerful, they use their voice and they use their privileged positions to oppose redistributive measures, to oppose more welfare spending, for instance. Then you have to say that the inequality that produces is unhealthy, right? Because it's depriving those of lesser means with the kind of opportunities and resources that are available to those in positions of power or privilege.
But to be fair, they do have a form of security in the form of highly subsidized HDB flats.
Which
is why I think housing is an essential form of security.
So I live and work in Hong Kong now. So you can very clearly see in Hong Kong this supposedly, or on paper, hyper-capitalist society with very little housing provision. Right? Social welfare.
So you would appreciate Singapore from that point.
So Singapore doesn't provide much. Then there's no basic pension. Right.
There's no pension at all. Or there is some.
There's no taxpayer financed pension. Right. The CPF, like Malaysia's EPF, is entirely financed, or mostly, vast part of it is financed by people's own contributions and their employer contributions.
If you work, you get the.
Right. So there isn't universal health care as such. Yes, there's a universal health insurance system, but healthcare is not free at the point of usage. There's no unemployment benefits. There's no minimum wage as such. But there is a very comprehensive, public housing system. So I've said many times that public housing is the de facto welfare state. Right, in lieu of other means of distribution that ordinary countries rely on, such as pensions, unemployment benefits.
I guess it's unusual.
It's very unusual.
But then come to think of it,
maybe it works for Singapore's context.
The thing is, housing takes a huge chunk in a person's regular expenses, and to have that as a secure.
But it's not free, Bear in mind
it's highly subsidized.
It's even that is a matter of dispute. Depends on what you mean by subsidy. There's no cash grant, or there's no large cash grant from the government for you to afford public housing that is sold at market prices. So what the Public Housing Authority, the HDB, does is to sell it at somewhat below market prices, right? Or at below market prices. And then people still have to pay for that by taking out the mortgage. So and then of course they can pay off the mortgage, at least in part, if not in whole, with their CPF contributions every month. So it doesn't take up a big chunk of their disposable income. Right. But it does there is a trade-off, right? Which is if you're using most of your CPF contributions to finance your housing purchase, it means less for your future retirement, right? So we have this phenomenon in Singapore where people retire, they still have asset, right? The house, which is appreciated in value, so they are asset rich, but they don't have much cash savings.
Yeah, and they have to go back to work, basically.
Yeah, or either they have to continue working, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? If they have the ability to do so or they want to do so. Or they will have to find some ways to monetize that housing asset, right? They either rent out a room or to move to a smaller flat. So it's not as if public housing is some sort of silver bullet to your problem of retirement financing, right? There are trade-offs. And whether those trade-offs are worth making depends on individuals, right? If what you prefer is a smaller flat, right, but more liquidity, then downgrade. But if you want to not move, you want to leave.
But it's a race to the bottom then.
No, it's not really not quite a race to the bottom because people make their own choices.
Right? Okay. Well, I mean, it's not all countries can afford an extensive and expensive public welfare system. So I understand why Singapore would be critical of such an expensive welfare system, but at the same time, Singapore is also a rich country, and surely it has some fiscal space to cater for.
Indeed. Yeah, that's one of the main arguments of the book. Is that it used to be the case, right, when these arguments were made, right, for more redistribution, that the argument was that, or the counter argument was that Singapore doesn't have the fiscal resources. This would, I mean, this is Lee Kuan Yew's line about how welfare leads a country to fiscal and financial troubles, right? And in the 80s, you could, there were debt crises in many developing countries, say in Latin America, then of course in Southeast Asia with the Asian financial crisis. Although it's worth pointing out, whether it was Malaysia or Thailand, it was not government profligacy that led to the Asian financial crisis. It was more the banks that were overly leveraged, right? And also that borrowed heavily in US dollars, but their lending was in domestic currency. So it was this currency mismatch. But again, you can imagine how, the elite government of Singapore would point to this example. See what happens if you, don't have a prudent government, right? Conveniently ignoring the fact that in both Malaysia and Thailand, government was running budget surpluses, or at least was generally prudent, right, in the run-up to the Asian financial crisis. So and of course now it just stretches people's incredulity, right? They just do not believe that the Singapore government cannot afford more normal social security arrangements, right, including having unemployment insurance. So finally, I think it was late last year, the new Lawrence Wong government, the new Prime Minister, announced that Singapore will also have unemployment insurance. So the book, right, which I published in 2014, had already suggested having some sort of unemployment insurance. So
they probably took a leaf from your.
I don't know if they took a leaf on that, but certainly relative to when the idea was proposed, and I'm not saying I'm the first to propose it. There were others who had proposed it earlier, but if you compare to when I suggested the idea and when they are rolling it, is 10 years too late or more than 10 years too late. Right. And Singapore has been a developed country for far longer than 10 years. Right. Singapore entered the ranks of a developed. Use the World Bank definition. It's probably in the late 80s that we became
very
advanced country. And of course today we are, GDP per capita is higher than even the US, right? And about 70%, right, higher than Hong Kong's, which is the next richest.
That's a huge gap.
Yeah, it's a huge gap, right? 70%, right? So nobody seriously believes that this is a government that cannot afford these. In no country in the world, even in the high welfare spending European countries, in no countries in the world are social transfers, right? A major, these welfare transfers are a major source of these countries' lack of competitiveness.
True.
It's other things. It's lack of investments in science and technology. It's
it's never about the welfare.
It's not because poor people are this enormous drag on the economy, right? It's very easy to blame the poor because they have, oftentimes they don't have a voice. Right? Most often it is, when a country screws it up, whether it's they get a financial crisis, or they get into some sort of other crisis, right? A man-made crisis. Usually it is the fault of elites, whether elites in the private sector or elites in government.
Right.
It is seldom the case that it is welfare spending that led a country to financial ruination.
That's true.
Right? I mean, name me in the last time you might say Greece, but it was Greece's financial troubles, financial crisis was part of the Eurozone crisis, was not caused by poor people in
Not
Greece.
at all. Not
Right?
at all.
It was caused by elites in government that were, of course, some were corrupt, some had cooked the books.
Yep.
It was due to Goldman Sachs, right? That, our favorite investment bank in Malaysia that had falsified, done all the kind of things that Goldman Sachs does, right? Vampire squid. So seldom is it the case that poor people cause a country to run into financial troubles, right?
There's a lesson. There's an answer for you.
Yeah, there's a signal from someone.
Okay, just moving on a bit. I want to touch a bit about democracy, because you mentioned about Singapore's highly skeptical stance towards the appropriateness of democracy. I guess this is also this parallel with China, as you spoke about at your talk just now, that China is not really a communist country. It is very much makes a hybrid of market socialist and all that. But I guess if you look at democratic states around the world, there are various examples of how the ruling elite uses democratic tools to exploit the uninformed public, the poor, and use these policies. I don't want to mention names of countries, but use these practices to steer people's attention away from core issues to all these emotional sentiments. Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think of this? Do you think that we're giving a lot of credit to democratic principles as opposed to what we have in places like Singapore and China?
Yeah, I mean, if I think this is Farid Zakaria's point many years ago. He was asked, given Singapore's success, don't you think, the Singapore-style authoritarianism, or to use a softer term, illiberal democracy, right, is superior to normal democratic arrangements? And Farid's point, and Farid is a big fan of Singapore, by the way, says like if most autocrats were like Lee Kuan Yew, that's fine. That's fine. Right? But most end up being more like Marcos or Mobutu, right? Yeah. So
it's a big risk.
Yeah. So normal democratic arrangements may not produce you the kind of growth that Singapore or even China had, right, in the last 45 years. But at least they ensure that the worst is avoided. Right? They ensure that the worst is avoided. You don't get, you have a truly corrupt, incompetent, inept, evil leader.
And it doesn't get to stay.
Yeah, it doesn't get to stay. It gets 4 years, right? But of course you can always question. I mean, this is an endless debate, right?
It's an ongoing debate.
Of course it is a case that if you get enlightened leaders, right, who work in the national interest as opposed to in their own self-interest, then you could run into severe troubles, right? But there's no guarantee that your authoritarian or autocratic system will produce that sort of leaders. Right. I mean, political leaders like Lee Kuan Yew are extremely rare around the world.
That's true.
And certainly after that, the 1980s, it's hard to think of authoritarian leaders that were in that vein, right? Up to the 1980s, you could say besides Lee Kuan Yew, there were people like the President Park, what's his name? Park, who was responsible for South Korea.
South Korea, yes.
Industrialization. You had Chiang Ching-kuo in Taiwan that used the space afforded him by Taiwan's authoritarian system then to develop Taiwan economically. Right. But post, I would say 1990, it's not as if the world suddenly saw the end of authoritarianism. You still continue having authoritarian leaders, but where else do you find authoritarian leaders in that mold? Right, where they put development of the country first and foremost.
It's really a hit or miss, huh?
Right. So be very careful what we wish for. If every country were to adopt Singapore's political system,
they better be sure.
You better be sure you have a sufficient, you have a guarantee that you're going to you're gonna fill those leadership ranks with
the good ones,
with good people and people who are not just focused on economic development and social development, but people who are not self-serving.
Right. Okay, let's move on. We are at the final few questions here. Let's move on to the outward policy. So we're talking about the growth model of development, because I think the crux of what we want to talk about is the growth model of developing economies. Where should we learn from, right? You said that developing countries should not vie to become trading or financial hubs like the likes of Singapore, Shanghai or Hong Kong, because their success is due to historical legacy as ports or entrepot. And not all countries have that legacy, and there can only be a finite number of hubs around the world.
That's
as
right.
you said. And of course, that network externalities render it increasingly difficult to survive in this competitive world. But if that's so, what can they be? Should they practice something like Korea, the early protectionism, such as in Korea, where they protect their steel industry?
Yes.
Where are you in this?
Yeah. No, I would put it as protectionism. Certainly, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, China, at least in the first 40 years of reform and opening, all pursued export-oriented industrialization. And the main feature of export-oriented EOI, right? Export-oriented industrialization is not protectionism. The main feature of it is we will expose our firms to global competition, right? We want them to export, right? And in order to export, you can't protect them that much, right? Because if you protect your own firms, then other countries will reciprocate by protecting their own firms. So if you want to penetrate global markets, then you also have to subject your firms to foreign competition, as well as domestic competition, right? I mean, so for instance, you look at South Korean companies that have become very successful, manufacturing companies, let's say Hyundai or LG or Samsung. It's not as if they were protected at home, that they were given monopolies. They weren't. LG always had to compete fiercely with Samsung. Hyundai always had to compete.
But within the domestic.
And that's just domestically. Right. Externally, they face even stiffer competition, right, with Japanese car automakers, with Japanese electronics, home and consumer electronics firms, right? So the essence of EOI is not protectionism, right? The essence of EOI is, you want them to prioritize exporting and that forces them to compete, to innovate, to become more efficient, to become more productive, rather than to constantly look to government for protection, for tariff barriers. So for instance, Proton, right? When Proton was established in the 1980s, it received a lot of government subsidies and tariff protection. So that's an example of import substitution, right? You want Proton to be able to replace the cars that were previously being imported. Right. So but today, more than 40 years after Proton was established, how many countries would you say Proton is competitive in? Other than Malaysia,
not a good case study.
Right? So
it's coming up.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Proton vehicles are not bad at all.
Not bad at all now.
Right? Yeah. But you can see how if they had been supported to pursue, or if they had to pursue exports instead of just being a supplier to Malaysian households, consumers, if they've been forced to export right from the start, right, that they must penetrate global markets. Imagine how different it could have been, right?
Yeah, but I guess it's a question of timing, isn't it? If we look at the infant industry argument, I remember Professor Ha-Jun Chang spoke about
there was protectionism among the developed countries.
The first part, before they actually became big enough to actually. So I guess it's all about that, right?
Yeah. So it's a question of whether you had that ambition, right?
Yes.
So in the case of Hyundai,
it's not supposed to be indefinite.
It should not be indefinite. So I think it's very important also. Besides external competition, your infant industry may not be ready for external competition, but right from the start, they should be subject to domestic competition. Proton wasn't subject to much domestic competition until many years later when Perodua came in, right? In South Korea, yes, Hyundai is very dominant today, but until the Asian financial crisis, Hyundai had to compete fiercely with Kia. Kia at that time was not a subsidiary of Hyundai. Hyundai to compete in certain vehicle segments with Daewoo, with Sanyong, certainly for goods vehicles, for commercial vehicles. So it was only after the Asian financial crisis that Hyundai became dominant domestically, right? It bought over Kia, and then SsangYong and Daewoo, I think, turned out to be not so competitive. But so in other words, competition is essential, right? Yeah, you may have some sort of infant industry promotion. You want at the early stage, because they're infants, right? You don't want to expose them to global competition, but at least expose them to domestic competition. Otherwise, what is it motivation for them to get better, to be more efficient? You might say, government inspectors will just have to visit them more often. Yeah, but we all know the phenomenon called Potemkin, right? The government inspectors come and we will tell a good story, right? So, Joe Stadwell, this guy who wrote How Asia Works, he describes development policy in many Southeast Asian countries, and he included Malaysia as one of those, as development policy became a game of charades, with firms pretending they have been achieving world-class competitive status without having to prove it in the marketplace. So in this game of charades, we pretend that we are getting world-class, or we are becoming world-class, and we say, see, this justifies why you should continue subsidizing us. We'll be ready. When will you be ready? In 5 years' time. In 5 years' time, right, ready for foreign government. 5 years' time, become today, we'll be ready in 5 years' time. Exactly. So, then you end up being fooled, right, by these state subsidized companies. Because if you don't have competition, you lack as economists would say, you lack a very important signal. How do you know they are not taking you for a ride? How do you know your subsidies are being put to good use, that they are, becoming better, they're becoming more productive, they are achieving world-class status?
Yeah,
right?
That's true. Yeah. Well, I completely agree with you.
And that's the thing about Chinese firms, right? Yeah, they followed the South Korean and the Japanese model very well. They, yes, they may be protected in international markets with subsidies and but domestically they've always competed fiercely with one another. Right. Whether it's the Chinese EVs today or electronic manufacturers in the past.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. A very good point. Okay. One last question before we go. Two more questions. Nurturing local champions. I think this is one of the things that you spoke about, which I really agree with. You mentioned MNCs and FDIs as a shortcut to industrialization. And you quoted Goh Keng Swee in his 1972 speech, and of course echoed by Rajaratnam, that without limit and controls, FDIs can result in overcrowding, inflation, and even gentrification to the detriment of the local people. But in some countries, like in the UAE, they rely very heavily on foreign talents, foreign workers initially, but then they have a strong policy of developing local talents thereafter. And soon, most of the top jobs in the UAE are taken over by the locals.
Yeah, Emiratization, right?
Emiratization, yeah. So what do you think? What do you think about this kind of policy?
Yeah, I think putting aside the issue of immigration, because it's a somewhat separate issue. Yeah, for domestic firms, alongside a strong presence by MNCs, I think you also need strong domestic firms, and not necessarily, and preferably not state-owned enterprises, right? Because then all you have is big firm capitalism. Right? This is William Bomo's idea of varieties of capitalism. You don't want just to have big firm and state-owned or state capitalism. The ideal combination would be big firms, right? MNCs, as well as maybe some globally competitive state-owned firms, alongside a thriving small and medium-sized enterprise
that supplies to the big firms.
Yeah, component suppliers,
like in Penang. Yeah, Penang is famous for this.
And they themselves are brand names, right? They themselves are, besides being component suppliers, they themselves have their own intellectual property. They have their own innovation capabilities. They're known to be, So for instance, like in Foxconn, right? Even though it is you can say it's a component supplier, it's a OEM, right? It makes stuff for other firms. Yeah. But it has its own distinct capabilities, right? And it grew from an SME, right? Yeah. So it's not the case that this is only possible if you have either foreign investments or state-owned enterprises. And I think this is an area where, even if you included Singapore, Southeast Asia has generally been far less successful than say Northeast Asia, right? Even just take South Korea. Right. How many globally successful South Korean brands can you name? We can easily name at least half a dozen, right? Yeah. Samsung, LG, Kia, Pohang Steel, and what else?
LG, did you mention?
LG, yeah.
LG, yeah.
I mean, and a whole lot of electronics
Yeah.
suppliers, right? Hyundai, Kia, and many South Korean construction firms are globally competitive. And South Korea's population is just 50 million. Now, Southeast Asia, at least the countries that are relatively more developed, or had at least had more years for development, I would include in this category Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines. And the combined population is 500 million, right? 10 times more than South Korea. And how many firms, manufacturing firms, can we name from the core of Southeast Asia that are globally competitive? And I think that's to some extent a failure of development policy. Right? Singapore can justifiably say, we don't need homegrown brands to some extent, right? Singapore can say we don't need homegrown brands because we are so small, right? But even so, I mean, the Singapore economy is not that small. It's like the 42nd or 43rd largest in the world, right? If Finland can produce, right, recognizable brands, if Denmark can produce, and they're all about the same size as Singapore. So I think, especially in this to some extent deglobalizing world, decoupling world, you need to have strong domestic firms that can hold their own against multinationals from elsewhere, right? And in Singapore, it's not as we don't have strong domestic firms, but they all tend to be state-owned, right, or at least state-linked, and they tend to be mostly services, right? Downstream services, those financial services, real estate, which is of course mostly parasitic, and so that's the problem.
Not much of IP-driven sectors.
Not that much technology-driven.
Technology-driven
right? I mean,
sectors.
You might say fintech, and
still services.
Fintech is doesn't drive the sort of productivity improvements that you see in manufacturing, for instance. So. Singapore has a big petrochemical sector, has a big pharmaceutical sector, has a big precision engineering sector, but these are all dominated by multinationals. Maybe some local suppliers to some extent, but they haven't really developed private enterprises that, not just have a strong brand, but have strong, innovation capabilities.
Okay. Very interesting. And okay, I guess in summary, I would like to ask your advice. We've covered so much ground. You've talked about all these important things that is needed for developing economies to take heed of. What would be your final last words? What is the lesson for developing economies? Like Malaysia and in Southeast Asia.
In Malaysia, there's no shortage of examples from East Asia that we can look to. Malaysia may say, Singapore is too unique an economy. It's just a city-state, right? With a very strong history of being a financial center. So that may not be the appropriate model. But whether it's South Korea or Taiwan, right, or even China in the last 45 years or so, they provided very strong evidence that with focus on economic development. So that's the goal. The strategy would be EOI, export-oriented industrialization. You want to bring not just foreign investments, you want to develop a strong domestic sector, manufacturing sector, strong domestic manufacturing companies that have their own
brand and IPs.
Brand and innovation capabilities. Then in a matter of 20, 30 years, right, or in the case of China, 40 years, you can go easily from low middle income or low income to high income. And one reason why Malaysia is still, we say, in the middle income trap is it hasn't really absorbed or implemented the lessons, right?
We're busy with other
frivolous
things.
That is the unfortunate thing, right? That instead of having this societal and political consensus that economic development first, right? We have allowed ourselves to be distracted
by a lot of other things. Well, I mean, I don't want to keep you much longer. I know you've been very tired. You've had a long lecture just now, and we really appreciate your time spent here So, Professor Lau, that's all we have for today. So, thank you so much
Thank you
for
so
taking
much
the
for
time.
having me. Yeah, it's been a great pleasure talking to you and to be at Penang Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to The Road Ahead. Stay tuned for the next episode. That's all from me.